welcome everyone to Oxford's Institute for Ethics in AI. My name is John Tsulis. I'm the director of the Institute, and our topic for this evening is AI in a socio-economic context. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our main speaker, who is Dr. James Manyika. James is chairman and director of the McKinsey Global Institute. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. In fact, the same vintage as me, 1989. Great year for Bordeaux, even better for Rhodes, where he did his doctorate on AI and robotics. Among other prestigious appointments, James has served as vice chair of the Global Development Council at the Obama White House. He serves on the board of the Council on Foreign Relations and is a member of the Trilateral Commission. And we are delighted to have him back at Oxford as a visiting fellow at All Souls College. James is going to talk about a number of themes, including the impact of AI on labor markets, the way in which AI may cause us to rethink capitalism and its future, and also the thorny question of what is ethics and how does it intersect with AI. We had originally scheduled two commentators, Grace Blakely and Abby Adams-Prassel. Very sadly for us, they've both had to pull out. We live in very sort of precarious times and unpredictable things happen. And Abby had to pull out at the very last minute, literally. So I'm delighted that my colleague, Ted Lechterman from the Institute, has stepped into the breach to offer some commentary. Ted is a research fellow at the Institute for Ethics in AI, and he's associated with Wolfson College. His current research focuses on the relationship between AI technologies and democratic ideals. His book, The Tyranny of Generosity: Why Philanthropy Corrupts Our Politics and How We Can Fix It, was recently published by Oxford University Press. And in fact, we're going to be doing an event on this book quite soon. But now I'm going to turn over to James. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stand up there, if that's okay. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you, John, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be back in Oxford. I thought, as John suggested, I'd make some remarks, at least in three areas. Much of this draws from a combination of some of the research and work that we do, but also from other things out in the world that I'm involved in terms of some of these commissions and so forth. I think where I'm going to start is perhaps talk about, so just to mark out the things I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk about AI and the economy and some of the implications, particularly in the labor markets. I'm going to come back to talk as a second topic about this question of the future of capitalism. We've been doing some work on that. And then third, I'll come back to ethics and AI. And I think my comments there are going to be more about what people in my neck of the woods are talking about when they think about AI and ethics. My neck of the woods being, I live in San Francisco, I work a lot in Silicon Valley, and I've been involved with quite a few AI research labs and AI research activities in a few places. So that's what I meant by sort of my neck of the woods. So I'm not a philosopher by any stretch. Starting with AI and the economy, I think it's important to keep in mind why AI matters with respect to the economy. I think there's several reasons for this. The one of the reasons starts from how we think about economic growth and productivity. And there's been a lot of work over the years about what is it that actually drives economic growth. So to the extent that we think about economic growth, a lot of people have actually gotten Nobel Prizes for this, most famous people like Bob Solow, where if you do what's typically called growth accounting, GDP growth typically comes from two places: expansions in labor supply and productivity. And if you look at the last sort of 50 years in most advanced economies, the economic growth that has happened has mostly come from both of these things expanding at the same time, particularly starting in the 60s. Labor supply expanded for a variety of reasons, the boomer generations, but also women entering the workforce. So that was a big part of it. The other half came from productivity. And productivity, as has been studied, typically comes from technical innovations and technological advancement. So we've relied on both of these two things. If you look at where most advanced economies are today, and in this regard I'd also include China, what's happening on the demographic side with expansions of labor supply, that's largely petering out. It's a very different story, of course, when you look at the developing countries, most of Africa and India and so forth, and Brazil. But for the most part, for the advanced economy, the contribution that was coming from the labor expansions of labor supply are mostly going to go to near zero, more or less. Immigration will help a little bit. Extending how long people work will help a little bit. But for all intents and purposes, we can't rely on that part. So it means that all the work is going to mostly have to be done on the productivity side if we're going to contribute to economic GDP growth. Now, we can have a debate about how important is that, but if we, at least for now, take it that that part is important to create surpluses that lead to prosperity, we're going to need productivity growth. And when we look at what's typically driven productivity growth, it's mostly been technological advancement. And one of the and that, you know, this is where the definition for AI gets very gray. Historically, that has come mostly from technological advancement, automation, and so forth. You could digital technologies that bleeds into AI. So there's the promise that one of the ways we can continue that growth is going to come from significant contributions from AI on the productivity side. So at least that's one part of the conversation about why AI matters. I think the other reason why AI matters just has to do with some of the, less about the economics of it, but more the kind of ability to help us address big societal questions, whether they're in healthcare, climate science, material science. There's all these possibilities, as we've seen from progress, whether it's the work that the teams at DeepMind and others have done in protein folding. That's actually something I've been somewhat close to because I'm involved with the team at DeepMind. So the possibility of these breakthroughs on big societal, technological, scientific questions, I think, is another promise. The other reasons why it's important is less always celebratory. This is the way it changes the structure of our economies in both good and perhaps challenging ways. One of the things about the development of AI is that the nature of the technologies themselves have these extraordinary scale effects. And the scale effects often come from the fact that there's a heavy reliance on huge amounts of compute, huge amounts of data, and that plays through in terms of often changing the structure of economies to the point where we might start to have these superstar firms or superstar structures in the economy where it changes the structure of the size and scale of companies in ways. And often that then creates almost the structure where you have got these super large firms with all these scale effects, and at the other end, a longer tail of smaller firms. So the structure of the economy itself starts to shift as you play out these technologies. The other thing that happens in the structure of the economy itself is, and it eventually takes us to the conversation about the labor markets, is the fact that, as technological advancement happens, especially of the automation kind, what happens is that the share of labor in national incomes declines. So if you were to do, for example, just a simple graph going back 100 years, and you've looked at the national income of any economy, the labor share of that was relatively high. It's been declining slowly. But in the last sort of 30 years, mostly driven by technological change, has been declining. So even before you get to the debate and the discussion about inequality and so forth, which we'll come back to in a second, the fact that the actual amount that's going to labor is declining, that becomes important if most people on the planet derive their livelihood from labor. And this isn't because anybody has chosen to do anything bad. A simple thought experiment can illustrate this. If you could imagine a factory 100 years ago, the majority of the inputs into generating the outputs were labor. Today, it doesn't look like that. It's a mixture of equipment, capital, and labor. And in fact, that mix has been changing over time just because it's more efficient, it's more productive, it's safer. So the mix of labor and capital, quite aside from the questions of who owns what, is just different. It's changing. So you have a whole range of these changes in the structure of the economy itself. Let me get to perhaps talk about the labor markets in particular, because when it comes to the role of AI, and here I'm going to be very broad in what I include in AI, just include this whole swath of automation technologies, robotics, as well as the kind of AI we think about that's getting at some of the cognitive tasks, if you like, that we do. This is the thing that's caused probably enormous anxiety in the last 5 or 8 years as people have started to think about what's going to happen in the future. And we've done, as have many others, by the way, there's been a whole cottage industry of these studies about the future of work and what's going to happen to jobs and so forth. It's quite an interesting study. But I think most of that work is coming to a general consensus of the following form, particularly when you look at work at the level of tasks as opposed to kind of whole jobs. This is the idea that if you think about what any of us do, it's a composition of a whole bunch of constituent tasks. Some are more easy to automate than others or apply technologies than others. We're not kind of monolithic in that way. So if you look at much of that work, one way to summarize it when you look at, so what are those tasks? For example, we've done work where we've looked at, in the case of the US, the Bureau of Labor Statistics kind of classifies something like 858 occupations. And there's some, we and they and others have a deep understanding of what are the tasks involved. So we look at the task level and start to look at what are the possibilities of the current and emerging AI and automation technologies to automate that. You get an interesting granular view of that. And I think the way I would summarize at least where we've come to in that research, and I think others may use different words, but I think it's generally a consensus, which is, I'd summarize by saying it's kind of jobs lost, jobs gained, and jobs changed. The jobs lost part refers to the fact that there are occupations where the majority of the constituent tasks can be automated. And of course, in those occupations probably decline in their totality. So you have some declines in that way. There's also the phenomenon of jobs gained. We know that, in fact, when technology emerges, and there's a long history of this, it often creates new jobs, new occupations. And we also know that when technology advances productivity, in a positive sense, it actually creates a much larger economy, and that tends to also add existing jobs. And then the jobs changed part is interesting because this comes out of recognizing that, in fact, more often than not, what actually happens is portions of people's jobs or activities get automated and the others don't. A good kind of historical example of this is the bank teller. What the bank teller did in 1970, before the broad-scale deployment of cash machines, was mostly counting money, either to take it from you or to give it back to you in some form. That was like 80% of what they did. If you look at what they do now, it doesn't look like that at all, actually. And in fact, economically, between 1970 and I think roughly about 2010, depends which country you're looking at, the number of bank tellers actually grew, in the economy. Although the number of bank tellers on a per branch basis declined. What happened is because the demand for branch banking went up dramatically, many more neighborhood banks, branch banks, smaller banks were opened up everywhere. So in aggregate, we actually had, there were more bank tellers in 2010 than there were in 1970. So this gets to the picture of these jobs changed, jobs lost, jobs gained, and jobs changed. So what does one take away from all of that? I think what we take away, and I think others too, is that at least if you look at the foreseeable future, because you can only sort of see so far and think of this as the next 2 or 3 decades, I think the concern about a jobless future seems unfounded because the net of declines, growth, and changes seem to suggest that on a net basis we'll actually have more work, unless of course our economies collapse. So that concern, at least for many of us, kind of goes away. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing to worry about. This I'd like to come to. There are actually a few big things to worry about, actually, in the labor markets, even if you get comfortable with the idea that there'll be enough work. So what are the things to worry about? Let me list a few. One is the skill challenge and the reskilling challenge. Because if you think about some jobs declining, some growing, many more changing, the skill requirement changed dramatically in that period. And in fact, that's why the whole topic about reskilling and education and retraining becomes a really important topic actually to think about how do we do that at scale, especially for the scale of the changes that are expected in most countries as these dynamics play out. So that's a big question. In fact, it's actually one that's particularly challenging at the moment when, in fact, if you think about the fact that across most OECD countries, the amount of money spent in the labor markets, both by companies and by governments, retraining or reskilling workers, has actually been declining for the last 25 years. So, governments and companies are spending less on that at a time when we think we're going to need even more of it because of these dynamics I just described. So the reskilling question is a real one, and how do we think about that? What does it even look like? What are the right ways to do it? What skills are we even talking about? So that's a big thing to worry about. The second thing to worry about is the occupational transitions themselves, because the economy has already been shifting. Some occupations decline, but how do we facilitate and help make those transitions easier? If there's a critique, and I think there is, about globalization, if we look at what happened with globalization while we're all in large part unhappy with it, there's almost two sides to it, I think. On the one hand, of course, I think it was a huge boon from the point of view of all of us as consumers, cheaper products, more variety, and so forth. I think that story is mostly documented. But I think to the extent that people are worried about that didn't work out so well, it had a lot to do with the labor job dislocations in places, mostly in advanced economies, that occurred. And if we think that the scale of those dislocations were problematic, these ones are likely to be bigger in terms of the dislocations. So how do we support people as these dislocations play out over the next, is a second question to think about. And then, of course, there's probably what may be the biggest one, at least in the context of this discussion, which are what I'll call the wage effects of all of this. Those are probably some of the more challenging ones for a variety of reasons. One reason is the fact that if you look at the profile of the occupations that will decline and the ones that will grow, most of the ones that are declining have tended to pay a lot of the middle wage incomes for people. It's a reason why politicians in most countries like to talk about good manufacturing jobs. It is actually true. Manufacturing jobs did, in fact, pay a lot of middle wage incomes. And many of the jobs that will decline tend to be, not all of them literally, but most of them are in that middle income, middle wage category. And many of the ones that are rising, that are growing, even today, have tended to be in the service sector, lower wage jobs, lower paid jobs, etc. So that change in mix itself creates a potentially problematic wage question. The other thing that also causes a wage question is even as technologists, and even in my neck of the woods, as it were, technologists like to talk about the fact that we're actually not replacing people, we're complementing people, we're augmenting people, which is technically true if you think about what the majority of what these technologies do. But that also has wage effects, some that are good, some that are challenging. The good ones is the classic one that everybody likes to point to, the radiologist, who becomes more productive because the machine's reading the images and they're doing other higher value added work, and the combination is good, patients are happy, the radiologist gets paid more, most people like us become more productive. That's a good complementing. But we also have to think about the other end of complementing, where the technology is actually complementing, if you like, the value-added part of the occupation. And what's left over is somewhat more commoditized in a way that expands the labor pool available to do that work, and often has a depressive effect on the wages for those jobs. So we have to think about these wage effects for all these reasons, and that's a big question. It's a reason why perhaps we might get into this conversation about, so how do we think about wages and incomes? Do we talk about UBI, basic income, all of these things? Because on the one hand, if these technologies and other things are creating these huge economic surpluses, and yet we have these kind of adverse wage effects, how do we deal with that? That's maybe a topic for conversation. This is why the labor question is actually quite important, because it kind of confronts society where most people are, because most people derive their livelihoods through their work. So let me move on to, I'll touch more briefly on the second topics. I think on the first one, John wanted me to spend a little bit more time on what I just did. But the second topic I want to just touch on very, very quickly is just on the question of the future of capitalism, since this is now being debated everywhere in almost every setting. And we recently wrote a paper which just draws on our research and research of others. And I think the essence of at least our view, my view of it is, on the one hand, I think if it's hard to argue with the facts that over the last 50 years or so, capitalism has actually delivered in the sense of driving economic growth, contributions to productivity, contributions to GDP growth, to, quite frankly, prosperity, and so forth in most market economies, especially the American variety. So I think it's mostly done that. But we also know that capitalism, at this point in time, there's so many problems with it. There's so many kind of, if you like, market failures. So what are some of the ones that at least we see through our research? I'll mention a few. I think this story that it's, when you look at it through the lens of people, this story that is delivered, it's primarily true if you, particularly in the last 20 years, which we dealt in some detail, if you'd been an entrepreneur, a company, a large company, large or small, a high-skilled, high-wage worker in certain sectors, this has been terrific, actually. In fact, the kind of economic gains, returns have just been phenomenal. Whereas if you were, at least in the case of the US, in any of the bottom 2 or 3 quintiles, it's a very different story, actually, in the last 20 years in particular. And let me point out at least a few failures. One is this inequality of people and place. So we know that if you've been a low-wage, low-income household, a woman or a minority, the effects have been adverse, actually. In fact, any of those demographic profiles, socioeconomic profiles, have not fared well at all, especially in the last 20 years, either as workers, consumers, or just households. The household story is particularly interesting to me in the sense that if you think about how households consume, we did some work looking at the question of the social contract. There's a whole set of things that households spend money on: clothes, electronics, cars, white goods. Most of those things have plummeted in costs over the last 20 years. Actually, thank you to globalization and competition for the most part. But a lot of the basics have actually become far more expensive, actually. So when we've looked across OECD countries, basics that include housing, education, healthcare, depending which country you're in, transportation, have actually increased in cost for most households, far above inflation in most of those economies. So that's the inequality, if you like, or the adverse effects on people, particularly for those demographics. The other adverse effect has been on places, because often when we celebrate job growth, economic growth, that's fine if you're looking at national levels. But if you look inside countries, it's a very varied picture. In the US and in Europe, we've done some work where we look at micro-regions. And the differences between micro-regions, or in the case of the United States, counties, that are doing very well and those that are not, is really quite dramatic, actually. In fact, it's actually widened quite a bit. I mean, one fun fact in the case of the US to think about is that unlike 25 years ago, today, something like 2/3 of the GDP growth that has occurred in the last, since the last downturn has come out of 6% of the counties. That activity has been in 6% of the counties in the United States. These inequalities of people and place is a huge market failure. Another market failure just has to do with this structure of our economy and the superstar effects of both firms and sectors and cities, where some firms, some sectors, and some cities have fared extraordinarily well, when in fact others who are not in those kind of superstar ecosystems have not. So that's a second kind of market failure. And then the third market failure I just wanted to highlight is the decline in investment in public goods that has occurred in most advanced economies, probably most acute in the United States, where by public goods investments, I'm talking about the kinds of investments that are important such as educational infrastructure, housing infrastructure, healthcare infrastructure, that often enable people to participate in the economy. And now we can even add digital infrastructure, which became very apparent. Both digital infrastructure and health infrastructure became very apparent during COVID. And we know that those investments in most advanced economies have actually been declining, actually some more than others. So that's another market failure. Then I'll mention two other quick failures, then I'll move on, because John has given me the eye.
No, actually, but go on.
That's okay.
It's just the mask has that effect.
Exactly. Two other important market failures. One is the inability to deal with climate change and price carbon into how we think about how our economies work. This has been, probably one of the biggest market failures, and that somehow the way these economies work have not been able to kind of price that in and give us ways to price that and take account of that. That's a massive market failure. And then I think the other externality that's kicked in, which is an interesting one because it gets you into more of a geopolitical kind of great power competition, which is at least, if you like, some forms of capitalism, particularly the American ones and others, have found it difficult to compete with very different economic systems. You can debate what kind of systems they are, whether it's China or India, because I think capitalism hasn't had in the history had to deal with close to equal other economies that operate differently and have had to compete with them. I think if you look at the history of the last 50 years, even as economies competed, they competed roughly within the same framework, if you like. You can argue, Japanese capitalism versus Nordic capitalism versus European capitalism, but it was largely the same framework with the same market structures, multilateral institutions, roughly the same ways of operating and rules. And now you have, for the first time, a multipolar economic world. And so there's a question about how do these systems compete and how do they deliver and how do they compete? So that's also causing a rethinking about should Western capitalism rethink things like industrial policy, for example, which has been something that market economies have largely tried to avoid or stay away from, how to think about that. So these are some of the market failures which lead to some very fundamental questions about, is this something, in fact, we're having a discussion yesterday at the Blavatnik School of Government about this topic, which is fun to discuss with some of the students about, does this system just need a few tweaks or does it need sort of whole-scale change? Where in that kind of spectrum what is actually needed? So let me leave that one. Maybe we'll get into it in conversation later. The third topic I was going to touch on, and this I'm speaking a lot more anecdotally and less as I'm not a philosopher like perhaps most people in this audience, are some of the conversations, at least in my neck of the woods, about ethics and AI, and what some of those discussions are about. And this is mostly amongst either researchers in AI, companies developing these AI technologies, and others who are thinking about this. What are the conversations and the topics on that list? Let me list a few. One is clearly the whole conversation about fairness and bias. There's been enough spectacular, terrible outcomes and results that have highlighted this. And that tends to play out in a few practical arenas, whether it's the criminal justice system or the healthcare system or in lending or in hiring, where you've seen these, in some ways not great outcomes. And so that sparks a debate about how should we think about building less biased systems, fairer systems. Is the issue in the data and how society collects the data, and therefore these algorithms are trained on terrible data. But that's one issue at least on people's minds. The second one is around this question of safety and security. And I think it often makes a distinction between, that may be useful, the safety part and the security part, because the safety part is typically referring to accidents. When things go badly, though, nobody intended. The driverless car ran over somebody, or these are kind of this a whole set of safety questions when unintended things happen. But then there's security conversations, which are different, because security at least typically assumes there's some adversarial activity or somebody who's deliberately trying to do something, either hack a system or compete with the system, but it's more adversarial. And so the question is how to think about these safety and security questions, which typically come out of very different places. And you're finding, for example, in the safety question, different researchers and companies approaching these things differently. There's some, in the case of driverless cars, for example, who are deploying the technologies into the real world and hoping to learn from that as they get deployed. There are others who are taking the approach to say, no, let's test and test and test and test and test until we think we've got it. So it raises this question about ethically, what's the right way to think about deploying these systems? So that's if you like, a safety and security kind of conversation. The other conversation is somewhat related to what my remarks earlier around just the economics of these things and the impact on people. And in fact, it's no surprise that some of the big advocates for universal basic income come out of, if you like, my neck of the woods. Silicon Valley likes to talk about basic income quite a lot, and we can debate, is that the right thing? So, but that topic is clearly on people's mind. One that may be a little bit emerging now, and typically comes out of the presumption that we're building bigger and bigger, better and better systems that are probably, if not all the way to AGI, but heading in that direction. By AGI, this is the idea of artificial general intelligence. And so as people think about the progress that's been happening, part of the ethical philosophical discussion is how to think about questions of value alignment. If we want these systems to be aligned with us, or something we care about, or to, whether it's in values, that is a whole question now about, so what's the way to think about that? What does that mean? Are we talking about aligning with what I tell it to do, what I intend it to do, what it learns from my behavior and therefore mimics what I do? Is it, and by the way, is it me, or is it my views and John's views? Is it, so how do we even think about, and it raises a whole set of normative questions, as you might imagine, about what is this value alignment conversation about? I was glad just the other day, on Monday actually, Stuart Russell, who's a terrific computer scientist and one of the foundational AI researchers, was actually giving his first, he's giving the Reith lectures this year, and one of his books is Human Compatible, and he's among one of the people who's a computer scientist who's thinking a lot about this question of human values and compatibility. But I think this is a conversation that should be had together with philosophers. And then the last point, and I'll end on this note, that typically comes up is this question of what does it mean to be human anyway, which is often debated and discussed quite a bit. So these are at least some of the conversations that are going on, at least in my neck of the woods, that I think should be had here at the Ethics and AI Institute. So sort of, John, I came to kind of dump all these questions on you and all of us to perhaps inform us. I'll stop at that point.
So Ted, when you're ready.
Yeah.
So thanks, James. That was a really stimulating set of thoughts. I'm going to make some remarks on three themes. I had to predict a little bit what I thought James might say, and so I think I got two of the themes right, and the third theme is a bit off, but it's also related to some things that I know James is thinking very seriously about, and so I think it'll still make for an interesting discussion. So I took it that sort of the first part of James's talk was about clarifying some of the fallacies around the economics of automation, some of the ideas that people have about what is actually going to happen when we more fully automate, or if we more fully automate the labor market especially. So I want to say a few words about some fallacies I think occur in common discussions of the ethics of automation. Not so much the economics, but the ethics of automation. So a first fallacy that I think is common in discussions of the ethics of automation and worries that people have about a transition to a more fully automated society is the fallacy of technological determinism. That automation is coming, whether we like it or not, and the only option we have is how to mitigate its effects. Of course, whether automation comes or in what form is a political decision that societies can make, different aspects of societies can make. It's not a foregone conclusion, and so we should be thinking about as well, how do we manage that transition, and not only how do we mitigate its effects. Second fallacy that I see in conversations around the ethics of automation is a sort of technophobic concern that machines are going to put me out of work and then I'm going to lose my means of subsistence. Now, I think it's a real risk, that automation will in fact put people out of work and their means of subsistence will then be compromised. But again, I think there are a lot of political choices here which can govern how exactly that transition is managed. Whether or not people's means of subsistence are sacrificed depends again on political choices and how that transition is managed. Third fallacy in discussions of the ethics of automation is a kind of status quo bias, that the focus of public policy should be on protecting jobs as they currently are, rather than using the threat of automation as an opportunity to reflect on what makes a job good and how AI might play a part in the creation of better jobs. Fourth fallacy, that UBI, or Universal Basic Income, is a panacea to the threat that automation poses. Now, I think Universal Basic Income is a fantastic proposal in many ways, but UBI can be used as an excuse for eroding workplace standards and for widening inequalities in general. You can imagine an employer saying, well, now that my employees have an alternative, I don't need to maintain high standards in the workplace, and I don't need to pay my employees very much either. And of course, Universal Basic Income doesn't take seriously the non-monetary values of work, that work provides us with a sense of meaning. It allows us to engage judgment and imagination, a sense of community. All of these things could in fact be lost if UBI is used to replace actual engagement in remunerative activity. So those, I think, are sort of four fallacies that are common in discussions of the ethics of automation, which are useful to think about in sort of concert with some of the fallacies that James was talking about in sort of economic predictions of what's likely to happen as AI is more fully integrated into the economy. So the second theme I want to pick up on is sort of the future of capitalism. And the question I want to ask really is, should capitalism have a future? And I think that's a worthwhile debate to be having, especially at this juncture. So if society is to be, quote, a fair system of cooperation between free and equal citizens from one generation to the next, and that's a quote from the American philosopher John Rawls, then a society, I want to suggest, cannot be a capitalist society. So as Rawls understands it, capitalism, even in its kindest, gentlest form, encourages wide inequalities in ownership. And the result of this is to concentrate economic and political power in the hands of a tiny elite. This is very consistent with what James was describing. Capitalism may not necessarily be inhumane or evil or irredeemable. It may provide a social minimum to cover basic needs and ensure that no one is completely destitute. In fact, a capitalist regime needs these measures to ensure its own survival. For when people simply can't get enough to eat, they're less likely to comply with the rules of the system, and they're not going to be effective workers in the first place. But a regime that provides some cushion against destitution is a far cry from a just regime. It treats the least advantaged as objects of pity and compassion, dependent on the grace of the more fortunate, rather than equal citizens entitled to reciprocity. So the system ultimately works to the advantage of the few. And I think James sees these facts clearly, but he comes to a different conclusion. The conclusion that Rawls comes to is that capitalism is simply incompatible with justice. There's no question about reinvigorating capitalism or managing a future of capitalism. The solution is, in fact, to go for a different regime entirely. And the regime that Rawls favors instead is something he calls property-owning democracy. In a property-owning democracy, productive assets are privately held but widely distributed. Privately held but widely distributed. And the point of institutions in a property-owning democracy is to provide everyone with sufficient means to be fully cooperating members of society, interacting on equal footing. One of the slogans for this regime is pre-distribution rather than redistribution. And I think it's interesting that UBI is often talked about as something that's part of the policy packages of a property-owning democracy, but just one plank in a sort of suite of many different policies. And to be frank, precisely what institutions are required by property-owning democracy is an area, I think, of active research and a bit ambiguous and vague. But some of the things that people talk about here are worker-owned firms, wide access to credit, strong antitrust measures, limits on inheritance, rather strict limits on inheritance, and publicly funded political campaigns, among other things. Now, you might think that some of the features of property-owning democracy align rather nicely with James's diagnosis of the ills of current capitalism. And so the question I want to pose is, are we simply disagreeing about labels, or does James truly wish to defend capitalism's fundamental pillars? Okay, third theme. So James has also written rather persuasively on the role of private philanthropy in helping to find solutions to economic shocks from AI in particular, and to addressing some of the ills of capitalism in general. And so I'm going to take the liberty to pick up on that theme as well. So there's a sort of long-standing Marxist critique of philanthropy, that philanthropy is a palliative measure that serves to sap the will of the underclass. It simply guards against institutional changes that would reshape the distribution of wealth and power. I think the best recent articulation of this view comes from Anand Giridharadas in his book, Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. Another view is that philanthropy shouldn't be a replacement for just institutions, but it can have a complementary role. And even in a perfectly just society, at least some forms of philanthropy would be desirable. So I see James as part of an important tradition of theorizing about philanthropy, which sees philanthropic foundations as a source of risk capital. Being free from the respective pressures of elections and earnings calls, foundations can experiment with bold new ideas. They can take a long-term view and develop innovative programs that can be tested, experimented with, and eventually adopted or scaled up by businesses and governments. So I think this is an interesting view, it's a promising view, but it also faces three what I would call democratic challenges. So when a philanthropic foundation becomes convinced of the merits of a particular policy or program, it's often not content to sit back and wait for the world to adopt it independently. You can take the education reform movement in the United States as an example, where a bunch of donors were convinced of a particular set of education policy proposals and began a sort of concerted campaign to get these proposals adopted, sort of by any means necessary. They essentially exploited their economic power to aggressively push a policy agenda using a variety of underhanded tactics, including astroturfing, restricted research funding, and so on. At one point, Bill Gates was called the unofficial national superintendent of schools because of the sort of tremendous unofficial influence that he was able to exert over education policy in the United States. So I think the possibility that foundations may wish to exploit their economic power to push these experimental proposals onto an unwilling populace is one of the democratic challenges of the risk capital view. But even if foundations are a bit more reticent to engage in advocacy, they're willing to stand on the sidelines and let others sort of champion the policies that they think are legitimate. I think another objection here is that foundations are simply initiated by and sensitive to the preferences of a particular class of people. There are many different ideas about social innovation. There are many different ideas about how to weather the shocks that AI will bring to the economy. Why should it only be this class of people who gets to decide which ideas are worth piloting? Finally, a third objection, which is just that the amount of wealth that elite philanthropists have to put towards piloting innovative projects is simply inconsistent with what's permissible in a just society anyway. Elite philanthropy depends upon economic injustice. So whether it's innovative and complementary to democratic institutions is simply beside the point. So what's the solution here? Well, here's an idea I only flirt with in my own book, but I'll offer it up in the interest of discussion. The role that James and others envisage for elite philanthropy, I want to suggest, could be better performed by universities at far less cost to justice and democracy. Let universities serve as society's fonts of social risk capital. I think this is an idea worth exploring. And I'm really grateful for James for kicking us off such an interesting set of topics. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
So we will eventually proceed to questions from the small masked audience in front of me, but also from the audience on YouTube. So please use the chat function on YouTube to ask your questions. But James, I wanted to give you now the chance to respond to anything that Ted said that you want to pick up on. Obviously, he raised a lot of issues there, so you can be as selective as you want.
Well, thank you. I actually welcomed Ted, your remarks a lot. And let me at least take two topics you've covered. First, on the question of capitalism. Nothing in the proposals that you suggested to me suggests throwing out capitalism. Capitalism is not, say, the same for the last 300 years. I mean, in fact, the current version we have is really a product and a feature of what started in the late 60s and probably came to be exemplified by what I'll call the Milton Friedman view of the world. That wasn't capitalism the 50 years before that or the 50 years before that. So in my mind, capitalism has always evolved. And I actually think the ideas around pre-distribution are very worthwhile, actually, because we know that enabling the next generation, in fact, to have the skills and access to resources, I think is a powerful thing. So much of that, I think, can still be done, and maybe to your point, we're debating labels, I think can still be part of capitalism. The reason I like to hold on to capitalism are the features of it that I like. I like the entrepreneurship, I like the innovation, I like the risk-taking part of that. I like all of those aspects of it. So I'd like to actually amplify a lot of that, but I also like to address the market failures, which is why I went through them, and I actually welcome your suggestion. By the way, your invocation of Rawls is interesting because if you think about John Rawls, he also had that second principle, the difference principle, which actually in some ways argued actually saved capitalism, despite everything else he says with the first principle in some ways, because it allows some measure of imperfection in the system, if in fact the imperfection actually allows the least advantage to benefit. So I think his difference principle actually helps in that argument. I think your point about nationally owned assets, I think that's actually quite important, by the way. Let me just say a few words about why I think that's important, especially at a time when, in fact, if you look at the features of, the increasing features of the economy as we are now, the kind of assets that matter increasingly look digital, increasingly look like intangibles. And in fact, one of the things that we highlighted, we recently wrote a paper on how corporations, what happens to the economic value created by corporations, how does it flow into the economy, into households. And one of the things that's changed is that if you think about the pathways of how value from companies flows into the economy and households, there's about 8 of them that we catalog. One of them is the labor income pathway, and that's been declining. The other one is the capital income pathway, and in fact, the capital income pathway has been expanding. In fact, one of the things we suggest for consideration is why not expand the ownership of that? So it goes to more wider, ownership by the public of companies and these assets and so forth. So I'm with you on all of those things. I think we're debating labels. I think on the philanthropy question, I don't disagree with your critiques, actually, including the non-democratic part of it. I guess what I find is that if society was as just as you'd like to design it to be, there wouldn't be any need for philanthropy. The needs that I see, and I've seen this in a couple of instances. One is, as John highlighted, I've served in various government roles and government kind of entities looking at these questions. And there are all these imperfections where government activities often are incapable of doing experiments, incapable of investing in kind of bold solutions, partly because of the way the accountability structures work, which makes it very impossible for anything other than a assured program that's been done 100 times and is guaranteed to work. You couldn't do unspeculative, uncertain things. So I think those kind of market imperfections in your perfect just society, I think are some of the places where philanthropy can play a role. I agree universities can play that role too, but I think philanthropy can play a role. What I do agree with you though is that philanthropy tends to be at some level undemocratic in the sense that it tends to mirror the interests of the philanthropists in terms of even when they're well-intentioned, either their passion projects or their passion issues in the world. Some people care about, health. Some people care about breakthrough science. Some people care about homelessness. So it tends to mirror the interests. So it is undemocratic in that way. But if we could do away with the market imperfections, and the one that I care personally most about is the risk capital part of those imperfections. I'd like to see that happen somewhere. And I think philanthropy is one of the places where that can happen.
If I could just jump in on this discussion. So, part of it is the difficulty about what Rawls means by capitalism. And I think he wants to distinguish capitalism from a free market. So capitalism would be a system where there is, in principle, limitless accumulation of capital in private hands. Okay? And he's saying, as Ted says, this is incompatible with this ideal theory of justice. Ted gave us one possibility, which is, he says, property owning democracy. The other possibility Rawls left was a liberal form of socialism. So your point, James, is, no, hang on a second, we can preserve capitalism short of having to embrace these more radical alternatives. So what I'd like to ask you is, you've identified in the current instantiation of capitalism, there are some serious problems. So one was this decline in public goods and investing in public goods. Another is, although there's been global redress of inequality to some extent, internally in societies, we've seen massive increase in inequality. So two questions. One question is, why has this happened? Why is there, for example, a failure to invest sufficiently in public goods around health, for example? Is it about the fact that globalization means that it's very hard to get corporations to pay their taxes because there could be capital flight? Is it because after the Second World War, the experience of war created a sense of communal solidarity that now no longer exists? So that's just an empirical question, the sort of thing you know about, I have no clue about. The second question, though, is this. Some people might say, what we need to do is actually go back to that dispensation of Roosevelt, the guy who saved capitalism, in effect, through big government. So big government needs to be involved in, for example, ensuring that there is investment in public goods, and also, now let's talk about AI, in determining what AI is used for, right? Because at the moment it looks like the lion's share of AI research is being dictated by a small number of large corporations. Do you think that part of the answer here would be that government has to play a more activist role in channeling AI, not towards things like surveillance or the attention economy, but rather to applications that actually further genuine public goods.
Well, you made a few points there. I think one thing we mustn't lose sight of is that even today, there are varieties of capitalism. And some have actually dealt with these issues better than others. So if you take the issue of healthcare, for example, I think Scandinavian countries would have a different view. I think Japan might have a different view. So I think it's worth remembering that we already have varieties of capitalism. And some, in some regards, have done a better job than others. I think one thing you would find, at least I find empirically, that much of our research tends to be very empirical, is that to the extent that you see differences in how capitalism plays out in different places, a big part of that seems to be the way the political economy is set up, and the way the politics of it are set up, and the way a particular society expects. And so I would argue what you have, in the US at least, it seems to be the most extreme versions of everything.
Yes.
So the productive output of it is probably the most extreme, the most successful, but certainly the most extreme. The imperfections of it, the inequality, are probably the most extreme. You go to other varieties, they have more muted, the ends are a little bit more muted. The economic innovation, productivity is not as high, but the downsides, risks, and exposure of individuals to the adverse effects are not as high either. So there's a question here about how does each political economy, and ultimately this becomes a democratic question and a citizen question, what is it that the citizens actually want their system, whatever it's called, to do? And how do they want to think about that? I think that's a question. In fact, some have even argued that even China's capitalist. It's just a state-run capitalism model. I mean, so we now have lots of varieties of this. And I think different societies are going to have to make choices about that. I think on the question of how to think about AI, I think one of the hard things about technology I find is, this is why it's so complex. I think most technologies work at scale. Scale is actually a good thing, actually, for a lot of these technologies, whether it's AI, whether it's platforms or any of these systems. I think many of the benefits come from scale. But scale also has these other adverse effects, whether it's market power, concentration, and whatever have you. So the question becomes what's the right way to think about regulation for these kinds of technologies as opposed to old world ways of thinking about regulation? I think that's the question on the table. I think it's a bit like capitalism. I want the best of the technology. I want the scale. I want the performance. I want all that stuff. But I also want a well-regulated market. How do we achieve both? The danger I see is where you end up with one or the other. An incredibly well-regulated market that just kills the innovation and the scale benefits of it, or you get all the scale benefits and it's a badly regulated. So I think that's
Is that EU, US? No.
You could say that. You could say that. I think that's the question. And what's happening in AI is, just to say one point about that specifically, I think one of the things that's extraordinary, at least I find, is when I did my DPhil here at Oxford a long time ago, and we're doing AI. And so if you're looking for the most cutting edge research that was going on anywhere in the world, it was actually in universities in AI and robotics. It was either Oxford, MIT, Stanford, Toronto, CMU, a few places that were publishing the most advanced, interesting papers, actually. Well, those places are still doing that. The problem now is, if you look at any of the key AI leading publications or conferences and see who's publishing the most, you find that in addition to those universities, probably the leading publishers of cutting-edge research, I don't mean applications, that list will include Google, DeepMind, Microsoft Research, because they're doing a lot of research. Why is that? Well, part of it is, if you're an AI researcher, right, and you want to do your best work, sure, you need amazing insight on how to build, deep learning algorithms, neural networks, transformer models. I mean, there's a lot of still scientific, mathematical work to be done, and universities can do that. But you need two other things. You need massive amounts of compute. So, you couldn't build at Oxford University the kind of large language models that can be built just because it costs so much. So if I was a researcher wanting to do that kind of research, I can only do that in some places and not others. You can't have access to the large amounts of training data to train these machines, right? So that's why you find that even as a researcher, even if all you care about research, there's just some research that you can't do at
Do you think
universities.
that part of the social license for these corporations to operate is that they make some of these resources available for public purposes, for example, by universities?
I think that's an interesting idea. I think you could imagine opening up access to these technologies and these compute capacities. You could imagine governments investing in compute infrastructure that's made available to universities. In fact, there's a recent kind of proposal in the US that some of us were involved in to build this compute research infrastructure that would be accessible to universities. Because otherwise, I don't think it's a good thing when this kind of research is only possible in certain places and not others. I think we have to address that. But that's just the reality of where we are, which is if that's the work you want to do, it's hard to do it. It's hard to do it in many places.
So let me turn over to questions from the audience. Yes, Kyle.
Yes, well, thank you so much for your talk and for the remarks. I think it came up enough times, the topic of UBI, for me to just ask what you guys think about it as a legitimate policy suggestion. Because, you dispelled some of the, ethics of automation myths that people are very concerned about. And I was just wondering, because, some people seem to welcome that, like the boost in automation in the sense that it can, boost productivity and then lead to, just enough money to fund a UBI. And I got the sense that you were a bit critical of it, Ted, but there's some argument for it giving people more bargaining power, so they wouldn't have to, and also generating other kinds of work that are not, traditionally financially compensated. So yeah, what are your opinions on the UBI as a legitimate policy suggestion, and what do you all think?
Any enthusiasm for the UBI? Do you want to each say something?
I have a lot of enthusiasm, actually, for the UBI, but I think, like many things, the devil is in the details. A very meager UBI, wouldn't accomplish very much, except maybe in terms of optics, and could be used as an excuse for not doing a whole bunch of other things that are very important. Often people think of UBI as replacing a bunch of other important social policies, which I think we should probably be loath to give up. There are certain kinds of goods that need to be public goods, for instance, which need to be provided. Other goods would probably need to be provided in kind. I think UBI as part of a policy suite is certainly a valuable option, precisely for some of the reasons that you suggested, that it can give bargaining power to workers so they don't have to accept deadening jobs, that it can compensate uncompensated caregivers who have been left out of the economy for far too long. But it's not a panacea and needs to be approached carefully.
James?
Yeah, I think, I find that I welcome the UBI conversation a lot, simply because, at least for me, it's a recognition that we have a wage income problem, actually. So I love the responses it provokes and the conversation it provokes. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say, therefore, it's the answer. Let me tell you what I like about it, what I don't. I like it from the point of view of its just simplicity. Everybody gets it, right? And if you were to do it, question is, can you do it? Where did you set it? Is it big enough? And so, but the simplicity of the idea is powerful. What I don't like about it is the fact that, to the extent that most people have tried to size what it would cost or what it would have to be, the numbers get very large very, very quickly. And in fact, the numbers that people then end up with when they try to make it reasonable tend not to actually solve the problem in the first. So there's something about just, okay, so if you say you like it, so how big does it have to be and how do you make that work? The kinds of things, and the other issue that I have, of course, is that I think, well, of course, incomes are a big part of what drives people's well-being and livelihood. Work provides so many other things. Connections, a sense of purpose, belonging, community, there's just so much more that work provides that would get lost with that. But then when you say, okay, can I construct a UBI-like scheme that has those features in it, whether you call it conditional income or conditional UBI, as some people have suggested, then the schemes get very complicated very, very quickly. And you start to wonder, okay, how would I actually administer that? If you say, we're going to give you something because you showed up to work in the park or to clean up, a street or whatever have you, can we actually know you did it, you showed up? And so the execution becomes very complicated very quickly. I actually think there's some very straightforward things we could do. Raise wages, right? Raise wages, as some countries have done in occupations that matter. So one of the things that's always fascinating to me is if you come at it either from a technological standpoint or from a societal standpoint, you end up in the following sense, in the following way. So technologically, say, what are some of the hardest occupations to automate with currently available technologies? Where you end up with, you say, caregiving, child minding, caring for right? You get a whole set of occupations that you say, these are probably going to be the last to be automated because they're so hard technically. Turns out those same occupations are also the ones that we tend to think of as the most human, the most, where our humanity is tied up in them. But guess what? The majority of them are the least compensated occupations. I mean, we all say teachers are important. We don't pay teachers very well. We'd all say childminders are very, very important. We don't pay them very well. So somehow we'd have to somehow connect the things that are either both hard technically to do or we care about them with how the labor markets actually work. And we've not been able to do that. We've not been able to do that.
Another way that workers had some bargaining power was through unions, and one of the other features I guess we would also probably have to talk about in this context is the declining power of unions in the period that you're talking about. Now I want to take two questions from the audience here before going online. So Nairi and Charles. So Nairi, do you want to start?
It was just developing further on the discussion we were just having, and I take off to start with. James, you finished on paying workers more. And of course, what's particular about technology is the way it has just so exponentially changed returns to capital versus returns to labour. And I wonder if, in your view, any of the ideas about how to give all workers a share in equity in order more kind of significantly to rectify that have any merit. And second, I think a couple of your other ideas are worth throwing into this bucket, the incentivizing of investments in workers so that there's more responsibility taken by firms for that. But also tax, as you talked about redistribution and how important it is for those tech companies to actually pay tax to ensure that the cohesive societies in which they flourish can actually continue to survive. And how do we get to there? It's a little bit depressing to see the unilateral move made by the United States on the OECD tax treaty, which was basically avoids digital tax and sets a different, it feels a little bit bait and switch to onlookers. So how would you move on that kind of tax in order to redistribute agenda?
Great. Charles?
That was a really great discussion. When you were talking about the future of capitalism, and you were talking about tweets versus wholesale change, and the narrative of market failures, I thought you were sort of more leaning towards the tweets rather than wholesale change. But then later on you were talking about political economy. And I wondered the degree to which you think that the effect of AI in enabling through the major social media platforms has almost completely undermined our capacity to make some of the changes that would be required. And we see this in the States with the culture wars, but we're seeing it increasingly throughout so that other side of AI and the associated technologies in undermining the capacity to make change.
Great. So just if I can summarize, that second question from Charles, to what extent is AI undermining the democratic deliberation needed to make the requisite changes because it stokes polarization and so forth? And from Nairi, two-part question, is part of the solution giving workers a share in equity, number one, and number two, how do we encourage firms to invest in workers and also, good idea, to pay their taxes?
Well, let me take both of those in the order in which they came. I think, narrow to your questions, I'm actually in favor of more worker participation in ownership in equity, partly because empirically we know that the capital income pathway, if you like, is one that's grown the most in terms of how companies create economic value. And so having more workers participate in that is actually, I think it's a good idea. So I'd find ways to expand that. However, so I'm all in favor of that because it's linking workers much more to what are the growing parts of the economy. In fact, some have even proposed that it's not just the capital part. Is there a way to involve and have people also participate in the intangibles that are created and generated by companies? We know that the intangible part of, if you like, the asset pool of companies is actually dramatically changed. So any of those participation, I think a world in which workers and citizens only derive their well-being through participation, through their labor, I actually worry about that. Well, because, never mind the inequality, that pathway is declining and will continue to decline. The labor share of income will continue to go down. So that's the answer to that. I think on the question of investment and incentives, I'm all for that. In fact, one of the, again, as somebody who spends time on the data, I think it's just striking to me that in most advanced economies, and again, the US is probably the most extreme in this regard, there's very little set of incentives in place to encourage companies to invest in human capital. There's all kinds of incentives to encourage companies to invest in capital because it gets depreciated, it can be written off, and all these things. We encourage companies to invest in R&D. There are R&D tax credits, so the firepower from an incentive standpoint, which has been put on those things, and I think it's right to have it on those things because they drive innovation, productivity, and so forth. Nothing comparable is aimed at human capital investment. So no surprise that investment by both companies and governments, by the way, it's not just companies and governments, on-the-job training and human capital has actually been declining. In Europe, it's mostly because of all the austerity measures that have occurred. In the US, it's always been relatively low, but the net is that most advanced economies have been declining their investments in workers everywhere. So I would say there's something about rethinking about the incentives for companies, for workers and human capital in light of all these trends. So I'll be all for that. I think the question of taxation, I actually think in some ways there's more, I think, there's been a rush to how do we tax? Before there's been enough of an understanding, what is it about digital technology that's changed even the way we should think about those questions? A bit like the regulation question. The regulation question is, you don't regulate technology the way we regulated oil monopolies 50 years ago, because then you're worried about price gouging. Well, what price are we talking about here? There's no, so same thing when we go to the taxation question. There's even the question about how do we even think about jurisdictions, right? Because with technology, you have a company over here, users over there, assets everywhere. What's even the right way to think about what that looks like from a tax standpoint? And I think simply applying what we've done for traditional companies, which tends to have particular footprints and assets, I don't think is the right way. So I think there's still, in my mind, a pre-question about, given what we know about the role of technology, how should we even think about these questions, both the regulatory questions and even the tax questions? That's where I would start. I think so I don't know if that, hopefully that answers your...
Well, how should we then? How should we tax technology? What are some fruitful ideas, do you think, that we should explore?
I don't know. I think we have to do the pre-work to say how does the role of usage and assets involved in technology platforms look like on a global basis within countries, between countries? Because that's one thing that's different. In the past, if you participated in another country, you probably had a sales force there, you probably had a manufacturing plant there, you probably had workers there. It doesn't look like that with these technologies. I can participate in your country while being over here. I can put my data centers here. But so we haven't worked through enough of those questions. I often think that regulators are kind of rushing to regulate, right? So I'd want to think about those pre-questions first, and think about even it's a bit like, you know, the other area we're getting into that looks like that, by the way, is actually going to be the climate change. Because, you know, all too often countries are rushing to regulate what happens in their country. But we know that if you do that, it has this cascading effect about energy sources in neighboring countries that can still flow back into your country. So how do we even think about when we have these things like climate, like technology, that are almost transnational in their structure, and the effects don't work with borders in the way that regulation for the markets work? And these are harder questions to think about for regulators, quite frankly. So I'd think about that. The other question I think that you asked, I'm not quite sure how to think about that. I think it's one of the harder questions, partly because when we think about the role that these technologies play, I often think that the distortive effects on whether it's disinformation or the democratic process, I actually don't blame that on the technology. These technologies, in my mind, are neutral. I think the question is who's using it for what. And I think quite often, I think there may be a business model problem, because what happens with a lot of disinformation, I think it's a business model problem. If you have a business model where you're going to derive value from more user engagement, and that's what links back to your economic model, it's likely that the algorithms underneath it are going to feed you whatever's going to engage you the most.
Stoke the rage.
And it's sort of, so, I have no doubt, some of you may be in this room, a lot of people who read a lot about climate science, good climate science, you probably get a lot of those feeds fed to you because it engages you. But similarly, if you're engaging in a whole set of other things, you probably get a lot of those too. And I think the question is, how do we think about, regulating content markets? Maybe we need to think about these things as content markets, as publishing markets, as opposed to simply. So I think there's a much deeper question about the business models underlying these platforms, particularly when it comes to things that matter to public discourse and our institutions of the democratic, political, social, and so forth. I think that's where the issue is.
And the state needs to intervene more to set the rules?
I would think so. I would think so. I would absolutely think so.
I want to go to some questions online. So there are two good questions from Mateus, and he's even-handedly provided a question for each of you. So Ted, for you, how would universities play the philanthropist role? I'm sure a lot of us have been thinking that. And how would this be better than the actual role played by the elite? Now, this is someone who assumes that universities are not part of the elite, which is an interesting assumption in itself. James, same questioner. Can AI be used for global justice instead of as a tool to create wealth? If so, how could we switch conversations and investments accordingly? So Ted, do you want to go first?
I think universities already are playing this role to a certain extent. I mean, one of the major functions of a university is to do research and development. The question would be, can some of that development be shifted or scaled up to take over some of the things that foundations commonly do? Can there be more research done on sort of social policy questions? Can there be more sort of social experimentation? And greater sums of money invested in these things. I think what's interesting about the university model compared to the model of a private foundation is that while the university is also often privately funded, this money comes from many different sources. It's not beholden to one fund, one set of interests, one group of people. And universities tend to be governed quasi-democratically. I don't want to, maybe democratically is the wrong word, but there are some sort of interesting governance procedures in place at universities which are intended to protect academic freedom, to ensure certain degrees of deliberation, which are missing in the case of private philanthropy. So I think it's just interesting to think about whether universities could take over more of the role that foundations often play. Of course, they would need more money to do this, and how we should think about that.
So I guess the short answer to the question Absolutely, yes. AI can be used for social good and social justice.
Global justice.
Global justice in lots of ways. In fact, if the questioner is interested, we were involved and have published some research on having looked at all the AI capabilities and tried to match them up against the 17 SDGs to see where could they help make a difference. So there's enormous amounts. I think the question, quite frankly, when it comes to this idea of social good and social justice is, are we investing enough on that side of things to actually make those things happen? So those are still possibilities. We know that these technologies can help give access to materials, literature, learning in ways that, quite frankly, give access to lots more people. I think the question, maybe this is a place for philanthropy in other places, which is, there's clearly a market failure here, which is, most AI people know all the possible good things that can be done. The problem is all the research, all the investment is mostly going to commercial applications and kind of building, commercial applications. How can we redirect, whether it's government money or philanthropic money, to enabling all these social good, global good opportunities, of which there's a long list? They just aren't happening fast enough, in my view, and have sufficient funding.
Can I ask you just two things around that? One is, do you think corporations have a moral obligation to do this kind of thing, to ask themselves how they can promote global justice? Or do you think that we stick with the model, the Friedmanite model, that the only obligation of corporations is to maximize profit? The second thing, apart from moral obligation, is there a self-interested reason? In the sense that a lot of AI applications, their functionality depends upon the data on which they're trained. And you can't just assume that something trained on, say, Western data is going to work in non-Western environments. So could there be a self-interested reason for them to think about their obligations outside of a Western context, partly because they need that data to produce applications that work?
I think on the question of just take those in reverse order. I think we often think of self-interested reasons, mostly consumer-related reasons. There's a whole bunch of other data sets that are extraordinarily helpful. Planetary data on deforestation that's now being captured by satellites in space that can benefit everybody. Ecological data, that data is being gathered. In fact, there are companies that make that data available to NGOs and nonprofits and universities free of charge, and that can be used for enormous good. So I think you're starting to see some companies do that actually and provide and make that data available. Some of them are startups, some of them are very large companies. So I think there's more going on there than I think people realize in that direction. I think on the question of, do companies have any moral obligation beyond what Milton Friedman said? Of course they do. And by the way, the Milton Friedman view is a temporary blip. So, Alan Murray at Fortune will tell you, at Fortune magazine, they've been doing this survey for a very long time about what is the business of business. And for the longest time, it actually used to include concern about society and the economy. In the 70s and the 80s, that's when it took a turn to just focus on shareholder capitalism. And I think it's making another turn now. You've seen corporations now embrace multi-stakeholder considerations. Now we'll see how that gets implemented, but at least the fact that they're even saying it, I think, is a big step, by the way, which would have been very different if you'd looked at what companies were saying in 1990 or even the late 80s. I think that's a change in the right direction. I think the question about societal questions, I think this is where it gets very tricky. And I think, again, it's a good topic for this audience. I think I can certainly see the moral obligation for things like, companies thinking about the effects that their products and services have on society, to think about the moral effects of what they pay their workers, to think about the effects that they have on the environment. So I think there's a set of those things that I think the obligation is quite clear, at least in my mind, because those are related to their activities. I think where it gets very interesting are other questions that I don't pretend to have a view on or an answer to, which is, what about other societal questions that have nothing to do with their business activities? So voting rights, so gun control, other things that are happening in society. How do we think about those from the point of view of corporations? Are they're extraordinarily powerful entities, but if you can't, if those are not directly related to their business activity, how to think about them? So I think when it comes to things that affect their business activities, their customers, their workers, society, the environment, damage that they may be doing, of course, I think they've got a moral obligation on those things. The other questions are more interesting. I could see a way, though, where if, in fact, you have a corporation that is, whose activities happen to be in a particular place or jurisdiction, and it derives its well-being from the well-being of those citizens in that place, and if people in that place can't vote and can't participate, maybe they should say something. But if there's truly no connection between this larger societal issue, I think that gets a little... I'd be curious what you think about that.
Well, it's an interesting issue. I mean, one of the ways that there's been an attempt to address this is by the UN's guiding principles on business and human rights. And one of the things those principles try to achieve, whether they do so or not is a matter for speculation, is to draw a distinction between the responsibilities of states and governments versus corporations. And, from a purely democratic point of view, you wouldn't want corporations taking over the position of the state generally. But that then leaves the question, what is the legitimate scope of activity? I think that's absolutely right. James, I want to thank you so much. It's really good for theorists to be confronted with realities, socioeconomic realities, and you've done a fantastic job in focusing our minds on the actual reality of AI and its impact on the world. And I also want to thank Ted for stepping in at the last moment and providing such wonderful comments, and without even shamelessly plugging his book in any kind of way. So. And I just want to thank everyone for their questions. Thank you so much.